Well, this last Wednesday, we finished our series going through the Gospel of Luke. We started that in January of 2024. And for me, every time I finish a book of the Bible, especially a long one, it feels like I've been running a race. And I've said for the last few months that when we're done with Luke, we're going to go to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. And we are, but just not today. Today, I needed just a little bit of a break. We won't be in Daniel on Wednesday either at our Wednesday night service, but we'll get there either next weekend or the weekend after that. Want to be able to have the opportunity to just share a few little one-off sermons with you, things that the Lord has put on my heart, a chance to give us a break a little bit before we dive into another long book of the Bible. But I do want to just put it out there. When we get into the book of Daniel, I think it's going to be pretty incredible for us to go through as a church. We're going to be looking at what took place in Old Testament in Israel, in Babylon, specifically with Daniel and the Jewish exiles in Babylon. And it's going to help us learn how to live as the people of God in the midst of a world that is at most apathetic towards God, if not outright hostile at times, right? How do we live in a world like that? How do we step up as leaders in the midst of opposition and lead in a way that points people to God? And in the book of Daniel, we're going to look at a lot of amazing prophecies that for Daniel were in the future, all of them. But for us, where we sit in history, some of them have already happened, but others will take place in the future for us. And so I think it's going to be a really incredible book. Today, we're going to be in a passage that most of you probably know, and that's Psalm 23. Psalm 23. Let me read straight through it, and then we'll talk about it. Psalm 23, verse 1, we read this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. When I was in first grade, we moved up from Southern California. Yes, I'll admit that. We moved up from Southern California to Canby, Oregon. And I started first grade at Canby, Oregon, Eccles Elementary School in Mrs. Rummel's class. Anyone else have Mrs. Rummel for a teacher? Okay. I thought that there might be a few people. Last night, my wife was the only person who raised her hand, right? And we both had Mrs. Rummel for first grade, different classes. I'm much older and wiser than she is. But it was a difference coming to school in Canby versus Southern California. And the thing that I remember most, going into the school, there was this big wall, and it had the faces of all the presidents of the United States on it. And I was like, who are these old men, right? With mutton chops and other things. I was like, what is this? I didn't learn about that in my school in Southern California. Go figure. We got into class and we would say the Pledge of Allegiance together. We didn't do that in my school in Southern California. And then after saying the Pledge of Allegiance, I started learning all these songs that I hadn't learned before. The rest of the class knew the songs. I didn't, I started singing things like, this land is your land, this land is my land, right? All these different things. But one of them in particular, we sang all the time, and I just sang it, I learned it, but I never really processed it until I got older. And in fact, I learned when I got older that I was singing it wrong for a long time. I always wondered why the song started out with talking about a man named Jose. And it went, Jose, can you see? It wasn't till I was older that I actually began to understand all the different lines of the song and what I was singing. The same thing can happen for us when we look at Scripture. A lot of times there are famous passages of the Bible that we might hear and might kind of process through on a very basic level, but do we really understand what is being said? For instance, I grew up, my father was a pastor, my grandfather was a pastor. You hear me say often, the last thing I ever wanted to be was what? Or a lawyer. I grew up in church. And I can remember my dad quite frequently bringing us into a time of somberness in church, where he'd be saying something, and all of a sudden he'd talk about prayer, and he said, as the Lord taught us to pray, and all of a sudden his voice would get deeper and very holy, and he'd be like, our Father, and then we would all start, quoting the Lord's Prayer. But it wasn't until I was older, and I preached through the Gospel of Matthew, and in the Sermon on the Mount got to the Lord's Prayer, that I actually stepped back and started looking line by line, section by section, what the Lord's Prayer meant, and processing it in a way that really impacted me on the inside. As I read through Psalm 23 just a minute ago, most of you have probably heard that. And the context you've probably heard it is at funerals and memorial services. This is the most common passage that people ask me to read at a funeral or a memorial service. And it's because of that line, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And we hear death, so we go there. This passage has nothing to do with that. And our context, the way we process this, I just want to reframe it for us a little bit. Who wrote it? When did they write it? And what is this about? This is a psalm of David. A psalm of David, the king of Israel. Sometimes I think we might get confused, and if we know things about King David, we know that he started out in life as a young shepherd boy, and because it starts out with that line, the Lord is my shepherd, we instantly go to shepherds and sheep, and we think David was probably, sitting on this grassy hill with all of his sheep frolicking around him, and he has his harp, and he's sitting there playing it, and comes up with this beautiful song about sheep and shepherds. Context, this is King David writing it. Not shepherd boy David, but elderly man King David. He is the king of a powerful nation, and he's not simply talking about sheep and shepherds and reminiscing about what it was like for him to shepherd a bunch of sheep, and now let's talk about sheep for the next several verses. It's interesting, most commentaries on this passage, and I would say the majority of sermons that you listen to on Psalm 23 focus a whole lot on sheep. A whole lot on sheep. And the most common thing in sermons that you learn about sheep, people go into all kinds of explanations, and you hear things. I actually found this ironic. All these different people feeling like they need to explain to congregations what sheep are and how to shepherd sheep. And I even heard one pastor say, in order to understand this passage, I went and I had to find someone who was actually an FFA. Have you ever heard of FFA? And it was, a pastor from a city. And I'm like, I don't need to explain to our congregation anything about sheep and shepherds. We have the Clackamas County Fair right here. the thing that people always point out in sermons over and over. Pastors start out and they're like, I just want you to understand, sheep are dumb. Yes. And they just pound that point and pound that point. Okay, two things. This is not about the sheep, all right? This is allegory. People talk in the Bible in metaphors and ways to illustrate. You look at me, and if you've been around our church that long, you hear me give illustrations while I'm out on walks. You hear me talk about eagles. Why? I absolutely love bald eagles. I love watching for them when I'm on my walks. So you hear illustrations about that. When I was in Maui a year and a half ago. Anyone here been to Maui recently? Raise your hands. All right, quite a few of you, yeah. Look at all you tan, beautiful people. When I came back from Maui for a month, all of my illustrations shifted from eagles to what? Sea turtles, right? Because sea turtles, I saw sea turtles, and what are they? They're the eagles of the sea. So I was trying to relate things about God to my own experience, and that you might be able to understand that way. That's what writers in the Bible do all the time, and King David is simply trying to make a point by processing something he experienced in his childhood. The point is not all about sheep and shepherds. This is the king of Israel talking about the one who has been his shepherd throughout all of his life. Now, why is he using the illustration of a shepherd? Not simply because he happened to be a shepherd boy. But in the Old Testament, the kings, the priests, and the prophets were called the shepherds of Israel. That's the way they're referred to. Those people in their nation who were the leaders. They were the leaders of the nation. And over again, they're called the shepherds. And in this instance, what you have is the chief leader, the king, the chief shepherd of Israel, saying to all of his people, I am not the chief shepherd. Yahweh is my shepherd. He had a leader or a shepherd over him. When we get to the Gospels, there's a group of people called the shepherds of Israel. Who are they? They are the elders, the chief priests, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the rabbis, the teachers of the law. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus refers to those leaders as the shepherds of Israel. And both Old Testament and in the Gospels, not a lot of good things are said about the shepherds because they're not shepherding correctly. When you get to the book of Acts through Revelation, the illustration shifts. Who are the shepherds from Acts to Revelation? Well, the Greek word for shepherd is what? Pastor. Pastor. And you could literally look at this passage this way. Yahweh, the Lord, the one who is the creator God, he is my pastor. Let's frame it this way. Because shepherd and sheep is merely an illustration. David is talking about the one who is his leader, who feeds him, who's there to protect him. Those three things. For years now, as I've talked with other pastors, as I talk with our staff at our church, our elders, I always try to remember that we are shepherds first. That's what we are. Pastors are shepherds first. And a shepherd has three jobs: to lead the sheep, to feed the sheep, and to guard the sheep. It can be really confusing sometimes at churches. People start wondering, what do pastors do? What's our role? How are we supposed to lead people? When you look at churches that are looking for pastors and they put out who they're looking for, usually that's not on the list. They look for a lot of other things, but a role of a pastor: lead the sheep, feed the sheep, protect the sheep. Right there. And I would say this too. In our culture today, we have a leadership deficit because in other areas of our culture, usually in government, the people in those positions of power aren't doing those three things: lead the sheep, feed the sheep, guard the sheep. Okay? Now, as we look at this, it just so happens, and I had never realized this until this week, this psalm breaks down into those three things. Those three things right there. Let's look at the first three verses together. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. First line, the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. I have the honor and the privilege to be a pastor. I said at the beginning, jokingly, but it was true, I never wanted to be a pastor. When I finally accepted that call, it took a while. I felt called to ministry, and I told the Lord, all right, I'll go into ministry, but I'm going to be a traveling evangelist, not a pastor. That way I can go to a church, say the things that need to be said, and then get out of town, right? But eventually I came around, and I don't like being called Pastor Tim. A lot of you call me Pastor Tim. I don't necessarily go by that. It's not like I call you by your job, right? Baker Bill or Builder Bob or Pharmacist Phil, I don't know. But Pharmacist Phil, that's anyways. Yeah. Sorry, I was about to tell a joke about drug pushers, but I won't go there. You look at it, it's an honor to be a pastor, but here's the reality about me. I will let you down. I will absolutely let you down. Don't nod your head so fast. You look at it, and that's the reality. Some of you have experienced that. You've known me for long enough. A few of you are probably like, I don't believe that. I mean, I've been at this church for a little while, and you seem like a great guy. That's because we're still in the honeymoon period, right? The reality is I will eventually say something that pushes your buttons. I will preach a sermon that you vehemently disagree with. I will tell a joke, and once it's out of my mouth, I will realize that joke could have been taken two different ways, and you just took it the wrong way. You will come up to me sometime with a need, and I'm not going to hear you because I'm going to be running around the building thinking about what I'm about to preach, thinking about, something breaking in the building, and I won't slow down enough to hear what your problem is, and you will be offended by me. I will let you down. Now, hopefully, you have grace enough to understand that. He will never let you down. King David saying flat out, the Lord is my pastor, I shall not want. I shall not want. And I love this line. For me this past week, I needed this. Here's an interesting question for you. If you've been around church, who pastors your pastor? Have you ever thought about that? Who pastors your pastor? For me, this was a week where I needed that right there to be able to go straight to God and say, you are my pastor, and I shall not want. The next line, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. a couple times a year, my wife and I like to go to Central Oregon, and it's beautiful. There's a big difference between the Willamette Valley and Central Oregon, and it's the color of things, all right? Around here, everything's green. Like I went on a walk yesterday, look, back to walk illustrations. I'm coming down Maple Street, headed this way, and you look out there, and what do you see? Green fields, right? I live across the street from Willamette Valley Country Club. When I sit on my front porch and I look across the street, what do I see? Green golf course, right? It's just green. Everywhere it's green. Well, the Willamette Valley is not like Israel. We're more like Ireland or England, right? Central Oregon is a lot closer to what Israel is like. Dry, rocky, dusty. One of the things I always love when we go to Central Oregon is we take Santiam Pass, go over the summit, come down past Settle Lake. You keep going down the highway, and there's all the beautiful pine trees, and we always roll down the windows and get that fresh air smell because it doesn't smell like mold and mildew over there. And it's like we can breathe. And then we get to a certain spot where off to the right, you get to see part of Black Butte. It's an area where they used to have horses. Usually there aren't horses there anymore. But the pine trees are cut down, and there's a beautiful meadow with some log fences, and it's all green, just that kind of mountain grass type green, just out there in the middle of this dry area. And every time I'm like, I just want to stop and go frolic in the grass, right? It's just so beautiful. In the mid-'90s, when we lived in Bend, I always liked it. There was an area where there was like a homestead that hadn't been sold yet. And there were houses all around it, but this one family still had, in the middle of Bend, cattle. And they had just this beautiful green irrigated area of grass. And it was so beautiful. Everything was so dry and rocky that then you suddenly see grass, and it's like, whoa, that's so beautiful. It looks so good. That's what David is talking about. In a rocky, dry, arid area, the Lord brings him to places where it's a grassy meadow and there's still water that are there for nourishment. Now, to him, as a young shepherd, he understood that, how he would have to lead sheep that way. And he is saying, as the king of Israel, I have one who leads me to places like that. And verse 3 gives the good explanation. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He restores my soul. That's what King David is saying. Leadership is hard. Life is hard. Life wants to kick your teeth out. And yet, there is a place you can go to be restored in your innermost being. Are you here today feeling crushed? Feeling like you just can't get ahead? Like life just keeps throwing thing after thing after thing at you? Look at David's life in the Bible. That's how it was. On one hand, he is this incredibly powerful, wealthy, successful king. But on the other hand, his road in life was horrible. And yet he's able to say, there is one that I go to who leads me to a place where I feel restored in my innermost being. He leads me on paths of what? Righteousness. That word paths there, it literally means old, worn, ruddy roads. Old, worn, ruddy roads. Roads with deep ruts in it. That's the path of righteousness. And David's able to look at it and say, this path is the path that he led my ancestors on. The people have gone before me. This is the path of righteousness. Or we could say it is the right path. I'm one of those people that when we go hiking and stuff, when we go on walks in different areas, we're on the path that's marked out. But have you ever experienced like you're on the path that's marked out on a hike, you're maybe on some trail somewhere, and you know you're supposed to go this way, but all of a sudden you see just this little tiny path. It's not marked out, but clearly people have gone that way, and you start to think to yourself, I wonder what's down there. Maybe I should go that way. And so you start to head that way, but then your spouse is like, get back on the path, right? That's the reality. In life, there are many paths you can take. There's a lot of paths you can take, and there's a lot of people that will try to tell you, this is the right path, that's the right path, try this one. This will bring you joy, this will bring you happiness. But there is only one path that is right. One righteous path. And David says, my pastor, my shepherd, my king, he leads me on the path to righteousness that will take me to a place that will restore me in the deepest parts of my being. How incredible is that? He leads his people over and over again. I love that. He makes me lie down. He leads me. He restores me. He leads me. That's all in the first 3 verses. In verse 4, there's a shift in this passage. In the first 3 verses, David has been telling us, the reader, about who is his shepherd. Everything, once again, he makes me, he leads me, he restores me, he leads me. He's telling us about him. Now it shifts. David is no longer telling us, the reader, about God. We get into the midst of David's prayer life. And the pronouns go this way. You. He is now talking directly to God. God has led him through the path of righteousness. And where has he been led? Verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I would like to think that when I start following Christ, that he instantly leads me to paradise. But the reality is, to get there, you have to go through this life. And it's hard. It's hard. David makes this illustration that this life is like the valley of the shadow of death. Notice it's not death, but as he's in this valley, the shadow of death is constantly there, lingering around him. But is he afraid of it? No, because his shepherd, pastor, leader is right there with him, armed and ready. I don't have to fear because he's with me. He's leading me to the place I need to go. We have to go through this, but he is here. That's incredible. That is incredible. I so appreciated listening to something Chuck Swindoll said recently. Chuck Swindoll is 90, 91. What did I say last night? 90. Last night in the middle of service, we asked Siri. Let's do it again. Hey, Siri. How old is Chuck Swindoll?
Chuck Swindoll is 90 years old.
Okay, 90. You got to love AIs, right? But 90 years old, okay? Chuck Swindoll just announced his retirement from pastoring his church, all right? Which means if I follow in his footsteps, you're stuck with me for a long time, right? 39 more years. Wow. Chuck Swindoll, in a recent sermon to his congregation, he is a shadow of the man he used to be. That rich, deep voice that he always had is getting weak, and he looked frail. But he looked at his congregation and he said, I can truly say to you that it's not the good times in my life, but it's all the times of hurt, pain, and tragedy that have drawn me close to God and made me the man of God that he called me to be. That's the reality. We go through the valley of the shadow of death. And when we walk through it with him, he is with us, guarding us, protecting us, and molding us into the people he has created and called us to be. Why do we have to experience these things in this life? Because we live in a fallen world. Go all the way back to Genesis 3. But he is working out his plan to set everything right. The last two verses of this passage. We've seen so far that this great shepherd, this pastor, leads his people, that he protects his people. And verse 5 and 6, you prepare a table before me. Last night after church, I went to the food trucks in town, and there were people from our church at the food trucks. And I was like, you guys went straight from church over here to the food trucks? And they're like, well, yeah. The pastor at the church we were just at was just talking about a big table prepared with food. They was like, we're getting all hungry, right? That's how it'll be the next service. You guys already ate, so you're good. But yeah, you prepare a table for me. This is talking about the one who feeds his sheep, who feeds his people. And how does he feed us? With spiritual food. Spiritual food. And where does he do it? In the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. That passage right there is incredible. In the midst of King David's enemies, God was not only there with him, protecting him, but David's like, heck, I didn't even have to worry, to the point he made a feast for me, and I sat down. I had fried chicken while they were all coming at me, and the Lord protected me. Isn't that incredible? You're like, fried chicken, spaghetti and meatballs, whatever your addiction is. You look at it, and there's this incredible statement, and you anointed my head with oil. What is he referring to then? All the way back to when he was a boy. You go to 1 Samuel and you read this story. Because of King Saul's pride and his sin, the anointing of God was taken from him as king. God told Samuel, go to the house of Jesse, and there I will show you who to anoint as the new king. Samuel went there. He goes to Jesse and says, bring all your sons to me. He sees the oldest son, and he is just this incredible, tall, well-built guy. Think like Jason Momoa, right? And Samuel's like, obviously this is going to be the king. And God's like, nope, not him. So he looks at the next oldest son, and he thinks like, obviously this is going to be the king. God's like, no, not him. He goes down the list of all the sons, and son after son after son, God says, not this one. And finally, Samuel says, Jesse, is this all your kids? He says, no, the youngest one, the runt of the litter. He's out with the sheep. Samuel says, bring him in. And as soon as David comes into the presence of Samuel, God tells him, this is the king, anoint him with oil. And it says from that time on, David was filled with the Holy Spirit. And that's the thing he's saying. Throughout his entire life, God has been with him. He has been filled with the Spirit of God, and his cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Two things about that last verse, and we'll close. One, it took me years to realize that surely goodness was not a woman. I literally, as a little kid, every funeral, I was like, who is this woman? Surely goodness. But two, the way he's able to look at this, all the days of his life, he's able to recognize that the goodness and mercy of God has been his. And that incredible ending. And it will be forever. This is not the end. This is merely the shortest prelude to a life forever in his kingdom, put right the way that it was meant to be.